Well, we all thought the tide was going out on Labor. We all thought it was over. It was a done deal, and Chris Luxon could just sit there in the McDonald's drive-through and sleepwalk to victory, and it hasn't happened. It is game on again after some canny moves from Labor, and we've seen in the last, month really, a dumpster fire of unpopular policies, and policies, to be honest, some of which we questioned and critiqued here on the platform. But also what we're seeing is kind of typical, unfortunately, of New Zealand in an election year. And that is that policies or payments in particular, and we've got them to students, we've got the National Party promising payments to parents of kids who are in daycare, early childhood education, students, pensioners, people with kids. Suddenly the government has dumped things like the cash for clunkers environmental rebate, like a recycling scheme, and said, oh gosh, we've found some more money, here it is. And I'm sorry, in my experience, this is called pork barrel politics, and it is, in my experience, a crappy way to run government policy. Should we expect it though? Does it have a point? Does it matter that much to the economy? And I thought, who's the best person I could get to give me an overview on this in an ideological or philosophical sense? Well, probably Eric Crampton from we're there? From the New Zealand Initiative, and Eric joins us on the line now. Eric, thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Well, look, to a non-economist like me, this looks like a bloody lolly scramble.
Well, there's a bit of that. You're right that they've been dumping some pretty poor policies, and that's all to the good. There were a pile of policies that we'd strongly critiqued when they were coming out, like cash for clunkers, like the proposed container deposit return scheme. Both of those would have been nightmares. It's great that they're getting rid of them. It seems a little odd that one way of coasting to victory for Labour is by abandoning a bunch of really dumb stuff that the prior Labour leader had favoured. But that also seemed to have been national strategy going in, that they were just not going to do all the dumb stuff that Labour had proposed. Well, now Hipkins is also offering that. So that's neat. There are a few separate things going on, though. So you were talking about the use of the tax system for providing benefits and how we should be thinking about that. I think it's probably best to keep all of these separate things actually separate. So the point of the tax system really should be to collect the amount of money that the government thinks that it needs for delivering whatever it's going to be doing in the least bad way possible. Taxes are terrible. Trying to find the least bad way of raising the overall amount of money that the government wants. That's what the tax system should be there for. So part of that is making sure that you're raising it in the most equitable way, or in ways that align with the government's views on what equity means. So part of that, I think, requires an inflation indexing. We don't view that as really a tax cut. It would mean lower taxes than we might otherwise have going forward. But if you look at the inflation bracket creep that you've had since 2010, when things were last adjusted, the $70,000 tax band, if you put that back in dollar terms from 2010, we would have been having the 33% rate come in at $53,000.
Wow.
If we had set that in real terms equivalent to what it is now. Or if you inflation ratcheted it now to meet the real value equivalent in 2010, the line for the 33% rate would be at like $94,000. So there's been massive bracket creep. How much you want to undo that? Well, that depends on your views on how much money the government should be raising and whether the current tax mix is kind of fair. But I would really like a principle that Parliament has to legislate to get more tax revenue rather than just let Adrian Orr do it for them. And that choices on where that burden falls be deliberate and deliberated in Parliament rather than just whatever happens to be the inflation and wage adjustments through the economy over longer than a decade as these things creep along. So I don't know that anybody would have considered it fair to put a $53,000 worker in 2010 on the highest tax rate at the time. If it wasn't fair then, why does it make sense now to have the comparable worker on a 33% tax rate? So that's one issue. the government has also been talking about need to alleviate some of the cost of living pressures, and has been tying this a little bit to some of the things going on in what it's doing with ETS revenues. That's giving me a little bit of encouragement. I wouldn't quite frame it as a cost of living thing, but the government raises substantial amounts of revenue whenever it sells carbon permits at auction. So you'll remember that under the emissions trading scheme, the government auctions all of the credits that wind up creating net emissions in New Zealand. Any other credits that are generated have to come from growing a tree or something else like that. The government auctions a lot of these off. They get a whole pile of money out of it, and that money ultimately comes from Kiwis' back pockets. We've argued for a couple of years now that the government needs to be putting in a carbon dividend with that revenue. So take the money, split it 5.1 million ways, give every Kiwi household a check. And they should use that then to help affect their own just transition. So the government keeps talking, and the Green Party in particular, keep talking about, well, we need an e-bike subsidy or whatever nice sounding thing, right?
But do we, in any of this, and I come back to kind of a fundamental, surely the person who spends your money best in your best interest is you. And any time the government takes money off people and puts it through a bureaucratic process and tries to achieve some policy end, that is the efficiency of that money for the good of the individual in a democracy is diminished. And you just can't get around that.
Well, there are some things that can only be done really through government. So if we ever wanted to buy nuclear submarines, it's unlikely we're going to just do that through a whip.
And I don't want to. It wouldn't be great if I didn't have to.
Agreed. So there are things that government should be doing. There are other things that we should be doing on our own behalf. And I think that our own transition towards a lower carbon footprint, that's something we can all be deciding on our own if the government would return the money to households through a carbon dividend. So they scrapped the proposed
cash for clunkers.
They seem to be carving out a little bit of room for a carbon dividend. So I'd put probably about even odds that we'll get some form of one. I think they'll do a hash of it. I think that they will likely say only households on lower incomes get the carbon dividend or something of that sort, so that they can provide a high dividend while still saving like half the pot for Grant Robertson to use as a political slush fund, which he's been doing ever since the thing got hypothecated. So it's subsidies to businesses.
Well, hang on. I want to road you back. What the hell does hypothecated mean, Eric?
Sure. So hypothecated means ring-fenced. So the government normally, whatever revenue they get from something, it all goes into this giant consolidated pot. The only exception from that is the National Land Transport Fund, really. So except for the National Land Transport Fund, where money paid by road users goes for paying for roads, otherwise everything goes into the big bucket of money that the government uses for everything.
Yeah.
Now, the ETS is a little bit different. A couple of years ago, they hypothecated the fund, saying that money from the ETS can only be used for ring-fenced climate kind of purposes. And I'm pretty sure when Treasury finally was able to agree to this, that they had a carbon dividend in mind, because part of the point of the carbon dividend is if you recycle the money back to households, people don't get as mad about carbon price increases, because at like about 80% of households would get more money back from a carbon dividend than they pay in, because rich households like mine, we spend more money on everything, we pay more into the pot gets split evenly, and most households then get a lot more back out of it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they've been wanting to use this for a bunch of dumb stuff instead.
Look, should we also be surprised that it is election year and governments do find money to give to people, and let's be blunt, it's pork barrel politics, and you can dress it up as policy or direction shifts or bread and butter issues. But the truth is, isn't it, an economist must see this, Eric.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just buying bloody votes, isn't it?
Sure, it's kind of neat. So a decade ago when I taught at Canterbury, I taught public choice, and one of the things we'd go through there is how pork barrel politics works. If you're looking at a proportional representation system like New Zealand's compared to a first-past-the-post system like the UK or the US or Canada, in first-past-the-post systems where it's electorates electing MPs and then the final composition of parliament determined by all of those electorate seats, you expect pork barrel politics to target marginal constituencies, like geographic areas where it's going to be swing votes in favor of the government. In proportional representation systems, you expect it to be targeting demographic constituencies rather than geographic constituencies.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
And clearly both parties are going for middle New Zealand, mums and dads with kids, right? Just
Sure.
the middle of the
And
road.
that's
They're fighting for the middle, and that's where they're going to spend the money.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the pain of the cost of living problems has been hitting, right? So the government has been ramping up benefits at least in line with CPI. Minimum wage has been hiking at least in line with CPI. There's a bit of a trick in it now that they'd flipped benefits from tracking wages now to tracking CPI. So that will turn into a ratchet that will just keep increasing the value of benefits relative to wages. But we can hit that another time or later on.
Yeah.
Also, the pain has been more people who are facing mortgages, facing high interest rates because of the prior Reserve Bank failures in dealing with inflation. So it makes sense that parties would want to be targeting that group. It would make more sense to benefit them, I think, by getting spending in line, not wasting the money, getting a carbon dividend in cleanly so that people can decide what to do with money on their own, and doing things to get costs down so that, well, people can afford a house without taking on massive mortgages.
Yeah. What does economic theory say about increasing benefits? When you increase benefits or government handouts, does it increase the number of people who rely on and live on benefits and government handouts?
Well, that'll always be the trade-off, right? So there's been some work looking at things like a universal basic income that finds less effect on that than you might have expected, that fewer people just drop out of the labor market than you might have thought. But some of those experiments, there's a bit of a trick to them that they use money that's from outside of the system, so people aren't really facing the tax rates that you might otherwise see. Whenever you look at work, say in the United States, on extensions to unemployment benefits, they find that when you've got a longer period of unemployment benefits, people seem to take longer to find a job. That's not particularly surprising. During the Clinton welfare reforms of the 1990s, they set a 5-year lifetime limit on receipt of welfare benefits. State by state, there were you'd have 10% or so of the welfare caseload that was exempted, so people who had long-term disability, that sort of thing. But beyond that cap, you had a 5-year limit. And where folks like the Brookings Institute had initially worried that this would cause massive hardship because people wouldn't be able to find jobs, instead, once people were hitting their limits, they went and found work. So by and large, that policy seemed successful in the later evaluations. You can look up work on it by the Brookings Institute.
But the fact is, it's an election year, so it's all about carrot, not stick in it.
Well, there's a bit of that.
And of course, after the election, whoever gets in, they'll say, oh, now is the time to tighten our belts. And we have another 2 years of austerity.
Well, at least they are ditching some very costly, very stupid programs. So we can take heart in that at least. But we have had a substantial increase in the size and scope of government over the period of COVID. A lot of it was not related to COVID. And scaling that stuff back is going to be really important if we want to be able to maintain the general sorts of tax levels that we have had.
Hey, Eric, thank you very much for your time this morning. And I know we were kicking around big concepts today, but always refreshing talking to you because you do have an academic take on what I think many people see happening around them. So thank you very much indeed, and for the work you do at the initiative. That is Eric Crampton, economist at the New Zealand Initiative. Yeah, it is pork barrel politics, and this is how it works, but maybe Labor are doing the right things, getting rid of some bum policies. And I was saying to Ben, one of the first stories we broke was cash for clunkers. And I think we said at the time, we may have had Eric on, we said it was a bad idea. Well, it's great. It didn't see the light of day at the end of the day. Did it? Which was good. Way back, Ben went in and was a cowboy.